communicate to the present community these stories and also the awareness of those places in which today people live, how the interaction between man and the environment can be a way to respond to the today changes in humans' relationship with the environment. So this is a very hot topic, Serge. Thank you. I send you, and for all this link, this is another example of John's work and the geographer I talk about, and with his project about memoryscape, this neologism is very interesting. Thank you again. I think your microphone is mute.
Yes, it was. I'm sorry. I was just saying perhaps we have time for one other quick question from the audience. Otherwise, I invite also Elisa and Alberto to share their email address. Alberto has done it also in slides, so that perhaps conversation may continue even beyond these limits that we have imposed on ourselves. It seems that there aren't other questions, and it's 3:20, which is to say that it's the time at which we should conclude this panel. At this point, I don't know if the members of Humanities for Change want to intervene directly, or I can, okay, I see Julia, who is going to host the next panel, actually the keynote. And so perhaps she would like to invite us to join her in 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you so much, Stefano. So first of all, I would like to give the floor to Professor Franz Fischer for his institutional greetings on behalf of the Bennett Center for Digital and Public Humanities.
Julia, here I am. I was supposed to welcome Jeffrey on behalf of the center, but he hasn't yet arrived, so I don't know if this is so useful if I welcome Jeffrey when he's not yet arrived.
Okay, so I'm sure he will be here for the time of the keynote. I know you wanted to invite our guests to another event.
This is actually an announcement I can make also in his absence. So Jeffrey Schnapp also accepted a second invitation in the context of this study day, and he will be present another time, so virtually in Venice at our center and at Ca' Foscari on Wednesday in 2 weeks, 16 December at 5 p.m., so in the Italian afternoon, and he will be in easy conversation with our students, colleagues, and participants about his MetaLab project or initiative. So an experimental platform for modeling new forms of cultural communication, creative and critical practices, and knowledge production. So that's, I'm sure he will refer to this initiative also during his keynote in a minute, but so there will be a lot of time for posing questions and also to discuss other projects of Jeffrey Schnapp. We will disseminate the announcement through all our channels, and I'm sure, so Humanities for Change is involved anyway, and so I hope everyone interested will find the specific details for this event. So Wednesday, 16 December at 5 o'clock.
Excellent, thank you so much. So what I can do now is presenting Jeffrey Schnapp to our attendees on Zoom, and I think soon also on YouTube. My name is Giulia Pellizzato. I am an associate researcher at the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard University. And I'm very excited to introduce this lecture by Professor Jeffrey Schnapp. He will arrive soon. While each panel of this conference investigates a specific facet of public humanities, this lecture will tackle the overarching question of information and knowledge, or if you will, the question of how to make knowledge matter in an ocean of freely accessible contents. It is our privilege to learn and talk about this with Jeffrey Schnapp, who is Professor of Romance, Languages and Literatures and Comparative Literature in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and also teaching faculty in the Department of Architecture at Harvard's Broader School of Design. He is the founder and director, as Franz said, of the Harvard Meta Lab, the faculty co-director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, and the chief visionary officer at Piaggio Fast Forward. So the list of his publications, awards, and achievements is definitely too long for these few minutes. So I thought of offering 3 vantage points, inviting you to find more on the vastness of Jeffrey's work after this lecture. So the first one is definitely the Harvard Meta Lab, which Jeffrey founded and directs. And I think it is itself exemplary of Jeffrey's approach. It is a community of scholars, designers, artists, makers, and technologists, but also curators and educators who are engaged in modeling new forms of cultural communication and knowledge production. A second vantage point is Jeffrey's involvement in rethinking libraries beyond the physical book, from academic publications like the Electric Information Age book, the Permanent Library of the Now, or the Library Beyond the Book, but also in a very concrete sense, Jeffrey Schnapp experimented new forms of libraries as multifunctional knowledge sharing spaces. So for example, in 2016, the Cabot Science Library here at Harvard was redesigned according to the recommendations of a faculty committee led by him. And in 2012, the Meta Lab created Library, a pop-up library experiment dedicated to exploring future scenarios for the library. A third trajectory could be, I think, Jeffrey's contribution to the ongoing conversation involving computational methodologies, digital media, and the arts and humanities fields. He is often presented as a cultural historian, an expert of knowledge design, and an active entrepreneur. But in this sense, I think he can be considered a cultural innovator and also a public humanist. I hope you will agree, Jeffrey. So now that I see you, I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of Marco Sartor, chair of the organizing committee for this conference, and also welcome you from the side of the steering committee of Humanities for Change. And just as an information, Jeffrey's lecture will be followed by a Q&A session lasting until 4:25 Central European Time. So it will be open to our attendees both on Zoom and YouTube. So you're welcome to submit your questions in the chat already during the lecture so that I can create a list and, if needed, combine the question. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Schnapp.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? We're good? Okay, great. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Julia, and thanks so much to Humanities for Change for this invitation. It's rare that one is the guest of an organization whose very name embodies so much that I think all of us care about, namely the notion of change for the better and the notion of the humanities, but particularly the humanities as reinvigorated by forms of practice that are public facing, that bring the kinds of expertise, the deep disciplinary roots that that each of us brings to a form of humanistic inquiry into forms of practice that don't just circulate within expert domains, but also have a social impact, are visible to audiences that will never buy the monographs that we write or the specialized journal articles that we contribute. However valuable those forms of knowledge may be, what falls under that umbrella of Humanities for Change for me immediately is this adventure of somehow re-establishing bridges between domains of specialized knowledge and audiences, which is to say also to establish those kinds of channels and avenues and models and formats that will allow those knowledge forms to really matter in society. I am going to run some slides here, but I'm going to use, hopefully this will work without any difficulty, the advanced functionalities of Zoom. So stick with me just for a second before I jump into my talk. Here we go. Hopefully, usually this works fine. There we go, just takes a second to load. And it's precisely on this topic that I wish to contribute just some thoughts that are based on my own experience as somebody engaged in forms of experimental humanities, that even if they don't necessarily call themselves or think of themselves as civic humanities or humanities for change per se, I think are very much aligned with that notion. And I've chosen to entitle this talk Actionable Knowledge, in part because I think one of the biggest challenges we face, not just in the human sciences, but in all knowledge forms writ large, all cultural forms writ large, is this question of translating, whether we call it knowledge or we call it culture, we call it science, translating expertise into forms, that containers, contexts that matter, that have an impact, that build audience. And so under the label of actionable, what I'm really thinking about is this problem of translation. And it isn't, in my view, ever a question of divulgation or simply the process of watering down expertise for non-expert audiences, but rather it's really a question of how we reimagine and reinvent and redesign knowledge forms that is at the core of this challenge of creating actionable knowledge forms. And I have, in my abstract for the talk, described this challenge as a challenge that I think we can think about in relation to a number of different crises that we face in the present moment. We have amazing proliferation of accessible, often very high quality information that is literally at our fingertips. 100 years ago, if you had asked ordinary citizens whether that would be sufficient to ensure that democratic processes, that public debates about issues of urgency and significance to society was sufficient to ensure good decision-making on the part of our leaders, a good understanding within the public sphere of the issues at stake, I think most well-informed people would have said, yes, of course that's sufficient. But we know from our own experience that that's not the case. And this information is literally at our fingertips, of course, through the internet, the ubiquity of networks, the supercomputers we carry around in our pockets as citizens of the 21st century. Yet, as you know well, on issue after issue, whether it's climate change, vaccinations, immigration, all kinds of issues of history and culture and identity, this ever-expanding library struggles to shape public beliefs and actions. And so for me, the real question is, how do we cut through the noise that conceals that kind of expert knowledge, makes it inaccessible, makes it invisible, or makes it unable, in a sense, to become actionable? And how do we make it matter? How do we make it impactful? And so in my view, there are two particular domains that we need to think about with respect to this topic, which is, of course, an enormous topic, and it's not one I'm going to exhaust in the course of a 30-minute talk. The two areas that I'd like to focus on, at least for purposes of this discussion, are the role of what I call critical design practice on the one side. In other words, how can a design-centric approach, carry out this process of transformation of expertise into impactful forms of knowledge, actionable knowledge. And the second, which I'll really only be able to touch about in the most superficial of ways, is the need for new models of university level, but not just university level, but training and organization that merge the practical with the critical and the theoretical. In other words, what kind of institutional platforms can serve this larger cause of creating actionable forms of knowledge, expertise that translates into impact, that reshapes public conversations? And I'm not going to be able, obviously, to be exhaustive on this topic. I simply want to sketch out some thoughts that really are based on my own experience, which goes back really into the early 1980s, I'm afraid, if it dates me now deeply. But it's experience that really goes back to not only the lab that I created at Stanford back in 1999, and I led until 2009, which was the Stanford Humanities. It goes back even further in time to the first digital humanities project that the National Endowment for the Humanities in the United States funded, which was the Dartmouth Dante project. On the right side of the slide, you see that is me with a head of hair at the computer center at Dartmouth College, which was the first American university to use a computer center as an integral feature of the entire organization of the university. That was in part because John Kemeny, the president of Dartmouth, was the creator of the BASIC programming language. And Dartmouth was the first university to have an email system as the communication system for the entire population of the college, from from the students to the laboratories to the faculty. And what were we doing in this picture? We were carrying out an experiment, which is present to this day if you work in the field of Dante studies. I was trained as a medievalist and was hired at Dartmouth College in 1983 as an Italian professor in the field of medieval studies. And in the context of thinking about an experiment using computational platforms and methods to support the field of Dante studies, we, with several colleagues, realized that in the case of seminal work of literature like Dante's Divine Comedy, there already existed this extraordinary database, which is the line-by-line commentary tradition, which started with Dante's own sons and extends all the way to the present, all indexed, connected word by word to the text of the comedy. But it was very hard to work with. 600 plus years of reception history of a poetic text. And so it seemed like low-hanging fruit, easy to transform into a database, except for one little problem. Machines at the time, what you're looking at is a Kurzweil, this is a Kurzweil machine, one of Ray Kurzweil's inventions, which is the origin of the scanner, a scanner that took up, literally this was the size of a closet at the time. The problem with the scanning technology, the OCR of the era, again, we're talking about early 1980s, was that OCR worked reasonably well on typewritten text. It worked reasonably well on industrially printed books and manuscripts, but it had never been used to try to scan any publication published before roughly 1850. And we didn't just have publications stated before 1850. We had hundreds and hundreds of volumes published between the invention of print and 1850. So how to train these devices to read Renaissance, Baroque, and Enlightenment period editions. Those were the kinds of challenges we faced. And sort of from that early adventure, I was led to really, on the one hand, see the limitations of computational technologies, but also to discover their tremendous powers and to get deeply engaged in this whole adventure of trying to think about how do we activate knowledge, not only in the sense of current knowledge, but how do we bring the past out of the storage closet, off of the bookshelves, out of the archival folders in which it's buried, and into circulation, into conversation. This is the same question as the question of actionable knowledge. It's an extension of that same question. Animating archives, building bridges to bigger pictures, and enabling collaborative work, because these kinds of projects are inherently projects that have a kind of scale, a kind of complexity that requires not just a single person, not just a single domain of expertise, but multiple competencies, multiple domains of expertise. So all of this is just to say that the platform from which I look at these questions, and I've built my own attitudes and my own approaches to these questions, is one that's informed by these experiences. In the case of MetaLab, which Julia mentioned in her generous introduction, we think of ourselves as, we call ourselves an idea foundry because we're deeply committed to the world of ideation. But the key phrase is the knowledge design lab. And by knowledge design, I understand the broadest possible approach to solving this problem of addressing the challenge of making knowledge actionable through design-based practice. And third, but not least important, is production studio. The notion that it's not about theoretical elaboration alone. It's not simply a conversation that happens within the confines of a research group or a seminar or a classroom, but rather we produce stuff, we make things, and that making literally encompasses physical making. It is not limited to the digital realm. And I'll have more to say about this mixing in a moment. Now, of course, you might call what we do digital humanities, and it is a form of digital humanities. I've chosen to shift my own self-description labeling towards knowledge design, in part because once you start to work with digital platforms and tools and resources and data sets, where the boundary is between the humanistic and the non-humanistic really stops mattering very quickly. And so I find the label digital humanities a little bit limiting, even though it's valuable. I think it's useful for descriptive purposes. I feel deeply embedded in the humanities, in the disciplinary traditions of the humanities. And yet I feel like humanities also is a limiting factor, just like the word digital suggests that somehow all that we do is digital, which is not true. The world humanities suggests that somehow our compass, the border stops right at the boundary line between humanities and social sciences, humanities and natural sciences. And that is simply not the case once you start working with data sets. So for me, the more encompassing way to describe this activity is this notion of knowledge design, even though I do find value still in the label digital humanities. I worry that it has a little bit of an anachronistic flavor to it because, of course, everything that we do today is tempered by, mediated by, in a such sense, touched by the presence, the ubiquity of digital tools, platforms, and technologies. So I'm going to talk here in very schematic form about two different domains, as I said. How do we make knowledge matter through critical and creative design practice? And then in the concluding portion of my remarks, I'll talk a little bit about models of training and organization that that merge the practical with the critical and the theoretical, particularly forms of teaching, different kinds of platforms for teaching as well. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to walk just quickly through some of the slides that I'm going to show, and then I'm going to step out when I complete the first round and look at some examples of practice. Early in my own life, my academic life, I made a discovery, which was not a happy discovery, which is that people often agree on a kind of broad theoretical level about all kinds of things within the university, within the academic world. You get lots of, if you wave the banner of interdisciplinarity, everybody says, oh, of course we're in favor of interdisciplinarity. But then when you practice it, you often get punished. So my focus, I've become very much a kind of Deweyan over the course of years. I shun theoretical discussion, and I am always interested in looking at models of practice, whether they're successful or not, whether they fail or they succeed. I think practice is what I look to, and I like to look at examples to kind of anchor discussions that have theoretical ramifications, but where the modeling of forms of practice seems to me like the key domain where we really make change, where we affect change. So once I've concluded the slide portion of this talk, I'm just going to look at I'm going to go back to some of the examples and kind of walk you through what I think is good or interesting about them as models for actionable knowledge, as I said. So making knowledge matter through critical and creative design practice in the digital domain. Let's start there. And there's a lot of potential domains, a lot of potential aspects one could talk about in this regard. Some of the domains that I've been particularly interested in and that I think are particularly promising have to do with getting humanists directly engaged in the design of databases themselves. The design, of course, their architecture is often integral to the forms of storytelling, the kinds of knowledge forms that we can extract from them. So I think this is a crucial strategic domain because it's very much part of the infrastructure that is required for humanities for change type work to take place. And that, of course, includes at a second level of elaboration, all kinds of approaches based on visualization, on sound design, multimedia curation of these kinds of assets. And in my work at MetaLab, but also just more broadly, have been really profoundly engaged in experimentation with cross-media and multi-channel content creation. And that includes, by the way, thinking about the present and future of print as a medium, which I think is a medium that we often overlook when we're thinking about the domains that are available for really transformative innovation. And certainly not last but not least, transforming data into experience, into forms of experience. There's something very abstract and elusive about data, and a lot of the conversation in society that we hear around data, I think misses the urgency of transforming, materializing data, rendering data in forms that translate, whether it's into storytelling or forms of argument, but also to spatialize it, to bring it into a different kind of relation to an audience, whether that's an audience of scientific knowledge forms or cultural knowledge. And last but not least, hybridities. And I'll come back to this in a second, but I think it's essential to underscore the fact that all of these various avenues for experimentation in the digital domain are never severed from the analog domain. On the contrary, they're always open to and most meaningful when they are embedded in forms of analog practice. And that's why in the subsequent slide, which concerns making knowledge matter through critical and creative design practice in the analog domain, the last term is also hybridity. I think thinking about hybridity is essential to the creative and critical work that communities like the one that are assembled in this event need to ruminate on. So what kind of adventures, challenges do we face in this particular sector in the analog domain? I think one of them I just alluded to before, which is remediating old media. The so-called old media that are the legacy media that we've inherited are all transformed by the kind of revolution that we've been living through over the course of the past 30, 40 years. And print as an example, which I just cited, is not the same medium that it was in the middle of the 20th century or in the middle of the 19th century. It's now a medium that is practically a live medium. You can produce books, and we often experiment with these forms in MetaLab. You can literally produce a book, a perfect book by every measure, traditional measure, in a matter of a day. You can have books with versioning, not unlike software. The book as an object is not the same object that it was 50 years ago. So what do we do with that? How do we leverage the power that and the opportunities that that implies? Those are some of the kinds of remediation opportunities that I'm thinking about here. We also need to reinvent and reimagine those fundamental institutions of culture and of knowledge, the pieces of infrastructure that are essential to what we do, which are libraries, archives, and museums in particular. Knowledge, of course, assumes a lot of form, from data sets to collections that are sitting in storage facilities, but also knowledge assumes the form of living collections, trees, plants, creatures. So how do we animate and activate those collections in ways that are meaningful, that go beyond also some of the conventional models that we inherited from the past century? And then in the process of doing these kinds of undertaking these tasks, how do we extract that kind of multisensory richness that locates objects in the world, that connects them to the physical world? And last but not least, of course, how do we build communities of knowledge around these experiences, that whether they're in the framework of schooling or in other kinds of frameworks? And again, all of these approaches come down to questions of hybridity. The digital approaches that I alluded to before, how do they weld, how can they be welded to, how can they be wedded to the physical world that we inhabit, that society, our society is rooted in? Now, of course, data is not easily escapable. It is the defining material of the century we live in. But data don't do things on their own. They have to be curated, they have to be shaped, they have to be crafted, they have to be made meaningful, beautiful, critical. And data is can no longer be dismissed as somehow outside of culture, but it's rather inside of culture. And it is a form of cultural heritage in its own right. So what do we do about that is really the question. But of course, data are not they're not given. They're not given as the word data suggests. They're architected, they're designed, they're crafted. And to digitize collections is a first step, but it doesn't get us to those higher level meanings, to those higher level stories, to the ability to construct knowledge forms. It's simply a first step. And to get to those higher stages of elaboration, we of course need infrastructures, and those infrastructures require long-term commitments and long-term processes that require significant institutional support. And of course, data are impoverished in a sense. They're an abstraction of the world. Our perception, our experiences of cultural objects are much more threaded, much richer. They're multisensorial. Part of the challenge of this hybrid world that culture circulates within today is, of course, that we tend to think of the analog digital as an opposition, as a dyad, but in fact, the challenge is to bring them together and to leverage the powers of each to do something that is mutually transformative, rather than simply reducing everything to a screen experience, for example, of the world of objects. And of course, the problems that we have with data are problems that are familiar to us from the analog world. Data are accumulating at absolutely vertiginous rates. And what happens when stuff accumulates at vertiginous rates? We know perfectly well from our analog collections. Stuff sits in storage, or it disappears. which often are essentially the same proposition. There's very little difference between the two. So I want to just talk about a couple of examples of practice, and then I'll close with the examples of institutional frameworks. I want to talk about one example of a very simple, very modest project, but it's a beautiful project of how to use a climate data set predictively. In other words, to persuade people to see something which is a slow process, a long-term process that is only perceivable otherwise to experts. So sea level rise and its impact on the physical landscape of a city. The second is, what kind of stories does an arboretum, a collection of 20,000 trees, tell? In this case, it's the story of the Arnold Arboretum, which is a research center at Harvard, but it's also a public park. A third example is, what can we do with a database that documents police violence? In this case, in the United States, 28,000 plus fatal encounters between citizens and police. How do we make that database into an experience, not just into an abstract statistic? And third, I'll just quickly go through these. An artificial intelligence as a co-curator of 250,000 art objects in a museum collection. How can we bring a collection alive in a way that's unfamiliar, different, new, that estranges our gaze but adds value to our experience? Now, each of these is a digital project, so to speak, but it's embedded in a physical, social, and a political context. The sea level rise viewer tells a story of where you are. You can plug in your zip code and it will show you exactly what's going to happen according to different scenarios for future sea level rise as a result of climate change. The collection of 20,000 trees is actually connected to a series of site-specific educational initiatives to bring that landscape alive, to make it a living learning lab, so to speak. The fatal encounters database is an updatable, it's a kind of live feed, if you like, that's constantly expanding a form of memory. It's a kind of monument in motion. It's that covers the entire territory of the United States. And the curatorial experiment I mentioned is designed for a physical gallery to be installed into that gallery, the Lightbox Gallery at the Harvard Art Museum. I think about these questions from the standpoint of my own curatorial practice in Italy. In particular, maybe a few of you are familiar with the Trento tunnels, the Galleria di Piedicastello in Trento, which are an experiment, a kind of experimental history museum that uses these two highway tunnels as a kind of space for linking together the museums of the entire region, but it's a very site-specific space. It's all about the place just as much and its physical structure as it is about the contents that go into these museums. And similarly in Bolzano, I was the chief curator for the repurposing of the first fascist monument, the Monumento alla Vittoria, the Monument to Victory, Marcello Piacentini's triumphal arch, which is a documentation center and a living archive. And these are all projects that have digital components, but they ultimately live as local structures. They're embedded in a social reality. So quickly, the sea level rise viewer, as I said, a series of data sets that document location by location by location, the potential impact of sea level rise on a physical landscape. Very simple proposition, but elegantly executed. The second example, an arboretum, a botanical park, a botanical garden, how the archive that documents its history can be brought alive so that that history is accessible to people on site, but also off-site in a new publication model. The third example, their names. This archive of a database of violent police citizen encounters over the course of 20 plus years. The fourth is this experiment with AI that's still an ongoing experiment called the Flitting Atlas of the Human Gaze, which is an attempt to bring alive a museum collection through a collaborative human AI aided curatorial strategy to be installed in the Harvard Art Museum in the spring of next year, COVID permitting. And of course, I could cite lots of other projects, many projects which I particularly like, including citizen science and citizen scholarship projects. The Ancient Lives Project, which some of you may know, is an interesting one at Oxford. It takes the Oxyrhynchus papyri, allows ordinary citizens to get involved in decoding the most difficult fragments of the papyri, the ones that philologists, classical philologists and papyrologists don't want to tackle because they're so fragmentary. And you don't need to know ancient Greek. You use form recognition, pattern recognition through an interface that's very nicely designed. But of course, there's many other examples of this, including the kind of work that's going on in astronomy in particular. Citizen astronomy has been probably the most successful area of citizen science. And we have many, many such projects in the Zoomiverse world, but they're certainly worth looking at as examples of practice in my view. So let's just quickly talk about this issue of models of training and organization that merge the practical with the critical and the theoretical. Again, here there would be many different models that would be worth discussing, putting on the table. One of them, one of the ones I'm very excited about, is the rise of civic labs of one kind or another. This one is my favorite one, perhaps because it's the one that produces the most beautiful data visualizations, which happens to be an area that I'm interested in with respect to critical and creative storytelling with data. But there are a number of such labs that have arisen, many of them connected to mayor's offices, to municipal authorities. The Civic Design Data Lab is just one of them. But the idea of laboratories that are connected to public entities, I think, as a space for research, but also for public persuasion and communication, I think is a very interesting platform. And it's certainly one that I follow with a lot of interest. A second one, which I think is one I want to come back to at the end of this talk before turning to some examples, is the role of museums. Museums as platforms, both for research, but also for outreach, communication, and public engagement. This particular example may be familiar to some of you. It's a work in progress. It is the Naturkunden Museum in Munich, which was one of the great natural science museums, a very traditional natural science museum with fantastic collections of, butterflies and beetles and ants and, so on and so forth, just as you'd expect. That museum is undergoing a transformation where it will be a museum, but it will be also a laboratory space where knowledge will be being produced inside the museum, and visitors will move through the spaces of the museum, in a sense, shuttling between knowledge in the making and knowledge as accumulated, collections that are on exhibit, but also future collections. And I think this notion of a museum as a platform that no longer is simply about preservation, about looking towards the past, but is also a place of production, where preservation and production become one and the same, or two facets of the same reality, I think is a very exciting horizon. And trying to think about what the architecture of such a structure looks like, trying to understand what the mission, what the programming stream looks like, what an exhibition is, for example, how an exhibition engages visitors, how it engages online visitors, but also how it engages offline visitors, on-site visitors. I think all of these ramifications of a shift in mission for museums, and I would extend this challenge to art museums in particular. I think art museums have been the least adventurous in this regard. I think is a really exciting area of opportunity that I look to. Another domain is, of course, within universities. Here, you're just seeing a screenshot of Duke University's Franklin Center, which runs these laboratories, which are ongoing research teams that work on different large topics that involve multiple disciplinary domains, multiple domains of expertise, and involve education and training of students who are the practitioners who then go on with their own skill sets that they develop through project-based learning to lead some of future projects. So these are three different platforms, three different institutional realities. One, the civic lab; the second, the museum-based structure; the third, the laboratory within a university. And of course, it's the laboratory within the university that I'm the most familiar with. It's the one that I work with in the case of MetaLab. Everything MetaLab does involves some moment in the classroom. Every project, no matter how connected it is to a specific outside institution or deliverable of one kind or another, always involves teaching and training through practice, hands-on training. Students are always integral to everything that we do, certainly. And sometimes it literally involves a course where making is integral to the course. So it's a different kind of classroom, I suppose, than the typical humanities classroom, but it is a classroom. It's a kind of classroom which is a cross between the seminar and the design studio, the architecture studio. In an architecture or design studio, you actually make stuff. You get your hands dirty. You go down to the shop and you cut pieces of wood, or you work with a laser cutter or the 3D printers, and you assemble physical models. Well, I think a kind of hybrid between the traditional humanities seminar space or the traditional classroom and that space of making is precisely where a lot of this work that is associated with actionable humanities can be carried on. And that includes, in the case of Teaching with Things, which was a course that I took. Whoops, my phone was taking over there, sorry. In the case of Teaching with Things, the course framework that was set up was one that was very much focused on what to do with a series of physical artifacts that are problem artifacts. Like, let's take the example that you see in the slide, which is what's called an ostrakon. An ostrakon is a fragment of a pot. When in Greek antiquity, pots were broken, they were not thrown away. They were used as post-its for writing. They were a writing surface. And many of these ostraka have messages on them that are extremely interesting. They tell stories, but those stories, of course, are fragmentary stories. So these are typically artifacts that exist in the hundreds, in the thousands, large numbers. And the sorts of stories that they tell are very rich and complex. In this case, and this is true of specifically of ostraka, they were used to vote on decisions that had to do with trials, basically trials of citizens who were accused of treachery, of being treasonous to the city-state. And citizens were called upon to vote for their exile or not. So an ostrakon is a vote, essentially a piece of pottery that was once a pot that is now a voting ballot, basically, that either says, yes, this person should be ostracized and sent into exile, or no. So how do you tell a story? How do you document? How do you describe an object like that? These kinds of design, but also museological questions, but that also translate into curatorial questions, are exactly the kinds of questions that I think are really rich for a classroom setting that's a making-oriented, a practice-oriented setting. And at MetaLab, we've done a number of these kinds of exercises. We ran for the Getty Foundation a series of summer training workshops for curators, for museum technologists, and other people, art historians interested in digital art history, a series of workshops called Beautiful Data, where we tried to explore the powers and limitations of certain data-based approaches to curatorial practice, to thinking about art historical practice and the like. And I'm going to close here with an example that's a future example, a forthcoming example in Italy, as a matter of fact. It's a partnership with the Museo Madre in Naples that is called Museo Futuro. which I think is a really interesting example of the second category that I invoked earlier in just a few minutes ago in this talk, namely the use of museums as a platform for expanded or augmented education and training. The object of Museo Futuro is not only to speculate about the future of the museum as an institution, the museum as a platform, museum as a kind of gathering place, but also the future professions that will be associated with this museum that is emerging, that is no longer just a place of preservation, but also a place of production, a place of gathering. So rather than inviting curators and art historians, in other words, museum professionals to participate, Museo Futuro is actually a training, a certification program for experimental museologists, for people who are not in the current museum environment, but rather who are interested, who bring skills to answering some of the challenges that the future museum will pose, but who aren't yet museologists. And this, this program is a training program which will involve some 20 to 30 young people in the Campania region by a competitive application process. And what they will be doing is participating in 10 meetings, each of which translates into a curatorial experiment around an object from the collection of the Museo Madre. The Madre is a contemporary art museum. It's an important museum, and perhaps one of the most important, if not the most important, contemporary art museum in southern Italy. But like most museums, most of its collection is in storage. And often that storage is filled with objects that have never been exhibited, objects that were acquired or donated, but that have never been shown. So what do we do with those objects? To digitize them, of course, might be a first step, but it doesn't resolve the larger question of how we bring them to life, how we make them matter, how we engage in meaningful practice around such collection. So the Museo Futuro is an initiative to build around 10 different themes, which are different metaphors for what a museum could or should be in the 21st century. Both a kind of very broad set of reflections on each of those metaphors, each of those potential scenarios, but each of them is connected to a curatorial experiment with a single object. And the itinerary that's involves some of the themes are the museum as a microscope. In other words, what happens when we just zoom in on a single object and see the whole world through that object. The museum as a telescope, the museum as a stage, the museum as a toy, the museum as a storage space, the museum as a plaza, a public place, the museum as a place of travel, the museum as a factory, the museum as a laboratory, the museum as a computer. With each of these themes, there's a curatorial experiment around that single object. And at the end of each of these 10 units, which will take place over the course of a year, we'll produce a book and probably an exhibition, a physical exhibition that expresses in space much of what's happened online over the course of this training. I guess I'd call it a seminar, a workshop, a series of workshops. So what's interesting about this to me is this is not a university, and it's not an academic kind of trajectory that's involved, but it is a use of an institutional platform, which is a museum, to think reflexively about its own mission, its own role, its own programming, its social outreach, its links to the world, the public face that it builds, the real facade that is its website, its web presence, its online community alongside its physical place in the world, and to do so in a way that leverages its power to summon together not just innovative, but that seeks out at least to expand its audience, to rethink its mission, and to embrace that change, not as a threat to its core identity, but really as an opportunity to innovate and to reinvent itself. Okay, well, so now we are at, let's see, I've gone on for about 35 minutes. We have about 17 minutes. Maybe I'll just look at one example. So I'm going to step outside of I'm going to go back to basic screen sharing. Hopefully this will be okay. And all right. Okay, you're now seeing okay, I'm back to regular screen sharing. And I'll just show, let's see, I'll just show one example here of the various examples that I mentioned. I gave you the web link, so you can always go and look at them yourself. I'll show you the AI-aided one, which is a work in progress. It's a future gallery installation, as I mentioned, that uses an AI-based, basically machine learning-based set of tools, of services to tag works from the painting, print, sculpture, coin collections of the Harvard Art Museum, and then with human co-curation, creates a mapping of this collection that allows audiences to see and explore the collection in a way that no human, just purely human methodology could allow. So what you're looking at is a map. And as you can see, when I move my mouse, hopefully this is coming on, this is clear to you as we're, so wherever I locate my cursor, I start to move through the collection on the basis of where the objects, these are all human portraits, where the gaze of the figures is pointed. So in other words, we're looking at the distribution of gazes. So here's another view, which is based on the different categories. So where do photographs look? When a photograph in the collection is present, where is the gaze of the viewers oriented? You can see there's a concentration in the case of photographs on frontal type gazes. But if we were to look at coins, coins typically look laterally because of the material nature. Now that's probably unsurprising to you, but it might be surprising to find out that in prints, that the typical portrayals of the human gaze are oriented downward and laterally, more orthogonally. In other words, that within different media, there are different kinds of biases. So I think what's interesting about this as an example is that as human viewers, we're very good at a kind of one-to-one gaze, at the engagement with a small corpus of cultural objects. But when we start to get into the world of data, when we start to get into the world of databases, when we start to get into the world of hundreds of thousands of objects, not tens of objects or even hundreds of objects, we move into a world where we need design-based solutions that allow us to have experiences of those collections that, like this kind of interface, bring those collections alive in unfamiliar ways, with cartographies, if you like, that are cartographies that are not on the scale of the human, but on some kind of other scale. And yet they can be about us looking at images of ourselves. They can still have that sense of connection. And I think this, for me, is where design-based practice, critical design practice, creative design practice becomes a key bridge to getting us from these forms of expert knowledge to forms of knowledge that, or culture, that have an impact, that reach audiences that matter. And I'll stop there. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for this amazing keynote lecture. So the floor is now open for questions. If someone wants to intervene, please let me know. I will start with one from my side. So if I understand, what you see as a possible platform for this practical and critical experiences is definitely the museum. do you see other possible platforms, especially in a COVID time when meeting in person maybe is not possible?
Yeah, I think every institution can be transformed into a platform for initiatives like the one I was talking about. I think I certainly think libraries, public libraries in particular, have played a crucial role in even during the pandemic in all kinds of domains, whether it's sharing, serving as resource centers for public health information, or simply for providing bandwidth and access to internet access to populations that are disenfranchised. So I see public libraries as a particularly valuable resource with regard, especially to forms of public and civic humanities and civic action. But it shouldn't just be libraries who do this. The reason I focus on museums is I think that museums have really been, not all museums, but many categories of museums have become so collection centric in their orientation that they've lost that civic orientation that sometimes they once had, or maybe they never had. But I see them as a particular opportunity, but I certainly would put libraries right at the center of any discussion of civic impact and civic facing endeavor. And I think universities have a responsibility in this regard, which they carry out sometimes successfully and sometimes not so successfully. I think there's still a strong propensity to think about public humanities as a watered down version of humanities or science or social science, when I think the real challenge is to go exactly in the opposite direction, as I tried to argue.
Yes, I agree. And so we have time for one more question. If somebody wants to intervene. Well, if not, let me ask you a second question.
Sure.
What I really appreciated about the project of Museo Madre that you present. Oh, I see Professor Fisher.
Oh, yeah.
No, okay. What I really appreciated, about the Museo Madre project that you presented is this reconnection with the local community, and also how the museum in this way really becomes a place for community building. So I wanted to learn more about if this is the first project of this kind that is run, or this is like the point of arrival of a longer journey.
Yes. So the Museo Madre has undertaken some really interesting experiments with community engagement, particularly with children and immigrant children, over the course of the past couple of years since Laura Valente became the director. And the Museo Madre is interesting because it's right in between one of the most popular areas of Naples and a more middle-class neighborhood, but it's really embedded in the fabric of the city. So it's I think, again, for me, the really exciting opportunity in these kinds of institutional realities is to be both hyper-local and to leverage the power of networks and connectivity to be interconnected and to be visible and global and to have an impact that goes beyond the local. So I think it's bringing those two horizons together that's, to me, is really the interesting challenge. And so the Museo Futuro initiative is I think it's the first such initiative, as far as I'm aware, in Italy certainly, but maybe I think it's a pretty unique initiative worldwide. But it is, I think, a model for some of the things we might be able to do in the future. And I see Serge Noiret posed a question in the chat about the M9. I will say that I was at the inauguration of the M9. I was hoping to be wowed and enthusiastic about it. I was not, for perhaps some of the reasons that may have become apparent in my talk. I think the reduction of history to projection, to screens, is a reduction. I think that even if there's a lot of value in some of the strategies and installation approaches that I found in the M9, to my view, it's insufficient, and it will not age well. And I think museums have a responsibility to create content and solutions that have a longer life than the life of a theme park ride. In other words, my feeling was that it's an interesting experiment, but not an adequately elaborated experiment, particularly in the way in which it relies on one sense alone, which is largely the sense of sight. I feel like there's a need for something a little bit richer and more complete, but I think it's an interesting experiment in any case.
So possibly, Luciana D'Arcangeli says it is very hard to have real practice of multidisciplinarity appreciated at university. Grazie from South Australia. So
yeah, I mean, I'll certainly agree with you. It's again, there's a lot of talk about transdisciplinarity in universities, but when you do it, you always run into obstacles. And for me, the solution has been to create laboratories, because a laboratory, first of all, it sounds scientific. It sounds, a lot of the forms of resistance that you get when you run into, the institutional apparatus within any university structure, they understand in some kind of loose sense what a laboratory is. And it's also a space of labor. It's a space of work. It's a space of research, but it's a space of making. And for me, that's exactly the space I want to be in.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We are honored to have had you with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Unfortunately, because it's a teaching day, I have to run and teach my graduate seminar literally in 4 minutes. So thank you all, and I'll look forward to the conversation in, I guess, in a week with the group.
Yes. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. So yes, as a friendly reminder, on Wednesday, December the 16th at 5 p.m. Central European Time, there will be another laboratory led by Jeffrey Schnapp with the students of the master's degree course in Digital and Public Humanities at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. So the event is organized by the Venice Center for Digital and Public Humanities, and you will find more details on the event shortly on their website or their communication channels. So now we'll have a half-an-hour break. I look forward to seeing you here at 5 p.m. Central European Time for the last but not least panel about the contribution of the digital to the tradition of literary texts. See you again soon.
Gut, danke. Dann würde ich mich bitten, Florian, ganz kurz zu berichten, was in der heutigen Qualitätskette passiert ist. Ja, kurz rekapituliert, was passiert ist. Da gehen wir